It was really good, and it was impressive because I feel like it felt like to me features were getting developed faster than they would have otherwise. Velocity does seem higher, and I feel like we get like draft level of a pretty meaty feature in like a day, and then completed in 2 or 3 days maybe.
If they can't fix it after like a few back and forths and it just keeps either introducing new bugs or just not able to fix the one single bug, that's really when I want to get involved.
It was awesome having Claude Code's ability to analyze an existing code base and explain the business logic for it, both to re-implement it itself and for us to implement.
As far as where it will go, I think that's a question that everyone is asking and that a lot of people have answers, and I don't know if any of them are are, are well founded.
Yeah, we have been talking a lot recently, just like everybody else, about the impact of agentic tools inside of our projects, right? Like more specifically, how do we just use them, right, to be productive as individual contributors? I think the tooling has gotten to a point where it's become much more reliable under the proper supervision and usage, right? Best practices. But it's got to the point where we're starting to move on to explore how do we actually integrate this across teams, right? And actually be intentional about our usage in projects, right? And how that relates to how we estimate projects, how we implement projects, and how we track progress on projects. So we want to talk about one of our first projects where we've kind of been this intentional about it, um, and kind of retroactively talk about successes, what worked, what are areas for opportunity, and how we are able to track the effectiveness of the tools. Scott, if you want to introduce the project to kind of talk about the context around it.
BumptUp is a native mobile app that helps pregnant and postpartum women stay fit and exercise. And they came to us via referral from an existing customer. They were looking for a developer or a team to help continue to build new features and enhance their existing mobile app that had been originally built by another team. The original app was built in a platform called Kotlin Multiplatform, which our team is not super familiar with, but we did spend a good chunk of time getting up to speed with it and implemented some real features, but it was a slow and painful process. Perhaps another team could have be lightning fast with it, but not us. But on the other hand, there are a couple platforms that we know that we can be lightning fast, or at least a lot faster than Kotlin multi-platform, and that's like React Native and Capacitor Ionic. Both of those platforms we know we can build features fast. So after our initial phase of work with BumptUp, where we implemented a few features, we implemented some promo codes, there was an in-app post-delivery survey, and there's articles in the app. And so we incorporated another way of having like midweek articles, because before there was only like one article per week. And we added the ability to have multiple. But yeah, that process was more painful than we hoped it would be. So there was just like this idea of like, what if we rewrote it in one of these other platforms that we're really fast at? So this leads to using AI tools. And so I put together a prototype using Claude Code, and it was really easy to make a quick prototype that showed the potential of React Native's ability to like mirror the look and feel of the existing app and show that it was possible. But this prototype tricked me, as prototypes tend to do, into thinking we could build the entire app faster than we did, because as I later learned, I was a little less familiar with the full feature set of all the things that the app had in it. And when we actually applied some deep analysis to like everything that we would need to rewrite, it was a bit more than I originally realized. So a key lesson there is that there's always a lot more going on under the surface of a software product. Like if you look at any piece of software, you're just seeing the skin or the facade, and you're not seeing the bones or the structure underneath. Yeah, one fun thing with Claude Code is that it very quickly made really decent looking React Native UI from screenshots, including the home screen and like a multi-page step onboarding flow that mirrored or closely mirrored how it works in the existing app. So that gave me some quick confidence, for better or worse, that we could rewrite it. However, something that appears to work is easy, but making something actually work end to end is harder, as we all know. So that was my initial experience with prototyping and some preview of like, oh, I thought we could get this done in like a couple weeks, but actually took us maybe a couple months, but I still think it's a win.
Definitely, after we talk with Daniel and Laurie about their experiences, to kind of wrap it up, it'd be nice to know and kind of talk about like, well, if this wasn't an AI project, like, would it have still taken a couple months? Like, still, what the end result was or impact on the overall velocity and delivery of the application? I'd be curious to know what that was. During your description, I kind of picked out 3 different use cases for AI, and I want to make sure we kind of focus on those as we talk about, actually using the tools, right? So there was code discovery, right? We talked a little bit about prototyping, right? And some of the pitfalls around prototyping. But there was a lot of code discovery, right? How do we navigate new code bases, especially in languages and platforms that we're not familiar with? There's an element of direct translation, right? How do we port the application from one platform to another platform? And then there's net new implementation of features, right? How do we build upon the new stuff? So I just want to keep those kind of use cases in orbit as we talk about Daniel and Laurie's experiences. So introducing, we've got Laurie Waller and Daniel Lindsay. They were the devs on BumptUp. And yeah, I just want to kick it off. I'm really interested to know what your experience with AI tools, be a Cursor, Claude Code, GPT, whatever it was, prior to starting work on BumptUp.
Yeah, I mean, I've been using, I think I got a ChatGPT account back when it was like 3.5 or 3.0, whatever the first one was, back 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. And I've had that the entire time and used that, very like a lot. And then also used Cursor the last few months. I think I got a Cursor account back in like May, maybe April. And I've been using that on a different project. And that had been mostly the extent of my AI usage. I've been just kind of using ChatGPT, posting prompts, posting questions, posting code when like when relevant, just kind of like working with it as a tool. And then more recently, as I mentioned, going with Cursor and using that in a more agentic kind of way and letting it kind of navigate around the repos that I was working on. But yeah, then Claude, not up until this project.
Yeah, I've had a fairly similar experience. I've been using ChatGPT and found it really helpful for isolated questions and for learning, especially if there was a technology that I wasn't familiar with. It can be a great teacher as long as, of course, you're validating, most of the information that you get from it, but it's a great kind of like Q&A format. And then in the last year or so, I've been implementing Cursor some. Most of the projects that I've been on have been using proprietary repos, and so of course we can't just integrate AI fully with those, but it's been helpful for personal projects, and I've been able to play around with it some. But this is the first project that I've used AI to fully assist building an app from the ground up. So it's definitely been interesting and definitely a learning experience.
So what was that first week like? Were you using Cursor or Claude Code as the CLI?
I was using Claude Code, at least for building this app specifically, and it was definitely, there was a bit of a learning curve as far as figuring out what Claude needed to be successful and figuring out what that relationship looked like. I went in, I'd say, pretty optimistic, and also we wanted to use this app as a use case to just see how far can we take Claude, and can we basically just give it a big prompt and have it rebuild an entire screen? Does it need a lot of hand holding? Does it need a tech design ahead of time? So we really kind of wanted to like throw more at it at the beginning and see how successful it was, and then kind of iterate it from there. So the first week or so was, like I said, a learning experience, because my general experience has been that it needs a fair amount of hand-holding. It's really good at some tasks like summary and analysis, but for a number of implementation tasks, it generally needs a pretty tight focus and a pretty tight context. And so in the first week, and probably more than the first week, I was feeling out what those parameters were and what those boundaries were.
Nice.
What about you, Daniel?
Say a pretty similar experience. I've only been on this project, I think, about maybe half the time as you. So like the project had already been pretty much going at that point, so there was more stuff established. So maybe a different experience than when you first started with BumptUp. Yeah, I don't know. Like I found that it was a lot better than Cursor right off the bat. That was like the main thing that I was able to figure out with it. Like being able to prompt it. It had all the context of what I needed to do a lot better than Cursor did, and also it had a much higher success rate. But I found that like it seems to be like I could get 85% of the way there very well, but then that last 15%, like I couldn't really on a larger feature, I couldn't really get it to prompt to finish that sometimes. Like it would be like I'd have to go dive more into the code on my own and then kind of finish out the feature on my own.
So in that case, when you're dealing with that last 15%, like were there certain techniques that helped you tie it off? Like was it more just like I'm just gonna throw more prompts at it and let it finish it off? Or did your interaction with it kind of change, right? Versus 100% generation versus kind of more of an iterative like programming approach? Or how did you solve those types of problems?
So historically for me with ChatGPT, like sometimes when I get errors, like I'll take the lazy way and just post, errors in the code and just see if I can like kind of brute force the answer out of it until something works. It's not always successful. With Claude, like I think I tried that not like too many times, but I did try and just kind of see if I could say, nope, that didn't work, nope, that didn't work, and a little bit more than that and explain like what was going wrong. But if it wasn't able to get it, I'd clear the context or start a new chat or whatever, and then like tell it to focus on a specific spot of, like one of the things I was working on at the beginning was notifications. And instead of trying to have it fix and look at the entire notification set of code that it had generated, I'd say like go look at this one section in our store and then try and focus on that. Here's the bug I'm having. It ended up having a little bit better of a time when the context I told it to focus on was smaller. And I don't know if like using Claude in that case is any better than posting that same function into ChatGPT, but that does sometimes help me with it.
So based on like finding those edges, right? Like I'm curious about like finding the boundary of what doesn't work. Like at what point is that 85%, right? What is it, a complexity issue? Is it a tooling issue? Like were any of you able to define like, okay, this is where Claude starts to choke and this is where I need to come in and change my strategy or go in and be the engineer and drive the solution? Can you like put a broader label on like this is where I've got to take over and be a little bit more of a craftsman versus, a manager?
I say for me, if it can't fix it after like a few back and forths and it just keeps either introducing new bugs or just not able to fix the one single bug, that's really when I want to get involved and figure out like, okay, like I'm going to go add my own console logs and figure out what is going on. Like why is it not, why is whatever this feature is or is not working? Like getting into the code at that point for me, if I've gone back and forth with it a few times and like, I feel like with AI, sometimes you still get into that loop where it tells you this is the de facto fix or something like that. This for sure will fix it, and then it doesn't. So like before that happens too many times, then I'll fix it on my own or start figuring out what is going on. That does bring up something else in my head though that I did start having it do over time, which was adding like excessive amounts of logging. I did find like on our home screen say like add console logging in every single spot that you possibly can to figure out where like these re-renders are happening. And so then what I'd be able to do with those console logs is I'd be able to post that into the chat, even if it's like 40 or 50 console logs, that ends up helping a lot.
Gotcha. So some debugging techniques that it was able to help surface. Gotcha. Yeah, I've personally found a little bit of a boundary around like if you can't give it a way to iteratively check its own work, right? And you guys are working right in that line, like React Native specifically, right? Where you've got a simulator and it's running on a device that doesn't necessarily, there's no NCP for it. It doesn't have a way to easily maybe monitor results or, the runtime on that simulator, right? Then it just says, okay, I'm done. I did it. and then you look at it and the screen's red and there's two different errors on it. So that kind of boundary is kind of what I've seen. Like, but if you can be successful in finding ways to let it check its results, right, and then try again and get into those loops, right, I kind of where I found it to be really successful in debugging specifically, right? So interesting, like some future work and like how can we better understand how to close those loops, right? Especially when working with like React Native or other mobile platforms. Scott, anything you want to add on your prototyping?
It was really fun, like just giving it screenshots and then kind of describing what you wanted, and then it could make components that looked like your screenshots. Like if you would give a task to another developer and they would be like this, and you'd be like, oh yeah, it's pretty close. It's like, but make these changes, and then it'd get like, and then it'd get 90% there, and then I might have to go and use my actual coding knowledge to go get from 90 to 100%. But yeah, it was fun to get something that quickly. Your talk about having like the console logging or having a way for it to check its results. In the future, it'll be interesting if we can have like MCPs for like the simulators, or for to give it a way to have an iterative loop to like make a change, request a screenshot from the simulator, or and then do some action. I recently also doing some changes to the Olio Apps website. And on the Olio Apps website, we have it deploying with Netlify, and there are deploy previews. And using agentic tools that can look at your pull requests, so you can look at the deploy preview. It can look at the deploy previews and actually use a Chrome browser to check its work. And then I've seen that in an agentic loop flow, specifically with the Devin tool is using this, but I think Claude Code and Codex, they're all coming out with the ways where they can do like kind of agentic pull request workflow. And I'm sure that's going to come soon for React Native as well. If it doesn't already exist, it probably exists somewhere.
And then on that CI/CD loop, it diagnoses the problem and then just
Ideally.
in GitHub itself, right? It says, okay, I'm going to fix this because
Yeah.
it doesn't exactly
Like on
match.
our website, I use it to fix some responsive layout issues. And I got it to fix the mobile viewport and the desktop viewport. And then it got stuck in a loop where it thought it had fixed it for this middle viewport, kind of like iPad level screen layout, and it didn't fix it. So now we're in one of those loops where it's confidently thinking it fixed it, and either I'm gonna have to go in and just manually fix it myself, or like somehow like dial down the context so it's like zeroing in on the focus.
Yeah. There's so much stuff to explore still. Speaking of UI, right? I know Laurie was the first on the project and you did a lot of the UI. So what processes and loops were you able to do as far as like the porting, right, of the UI and the UX from Kotlin over to React Native? Like was there agentic loops or just processes that you developed over time? Did those processes speed up or change over your usage? And then last question, like by the end of it, how much more effective were you at building out that UI with Claude versus without, right? If you were doing it kind of manually.
Yeah, it definitely sped up over time for a number of reasons. I think one was processes, and then two, we had established patterns for Claude to work off of. So starting out, we pretty much just had a repro from scratch, and I was also learning Claude. So the process that I've landed on is having it take time to analyze the existing app. So say that I'm porting over a form, for example, I'll have it provide a detailed analysis of that form. What are the styles that it uses? How is the form state handle? What API does it call? And then once it sends that back, I'll review that form or I'll review its analysis, ask it questions, and then from there I'll have it create an implementation checklist and then have it implement that checklist piece by piece so that I can validate, maybe the UI first, and then validate the form state, and then validate how the error handling is working, and then last check how the API calls are being handled. And breaking it down into those slices of work has been much more successful and has sped up the process. And then also, once we had established patterns of how we wanted to handle like form state or server calls or things like that, that was also a lot more successful because I could give it another screen as a pattern to work off of so that it had more context there and wasn't just sort of making things up as it went.
How long would it take you to say like implement a new screen or a new feature, right? Like coming up with heuristics and tracking, right? The gains or the effectiveness of this, I know is super hard, but are you able in any sense to kind of estimate from your own experience, right? Like how much quicker you're able to deliver that sort of work?
Mm, right. It depends on the feature, of course, because some features Claude is more successful at. I've seen it be more successful at, say, porting over calculators than it is at implementing UI. And so sometimes I'll spend more time perfecting UI and maybe perfecting validation than I will maybe setting up a calculator. It tends to handle business logic a bit better, I've found. As far as how much faster, again, it depends on the feature, but I would say overall ballpark figure maybe 40%, something like that. Yeah, so sometimes it feels a bit slower, and then other times it's faster, but that's roughly an overall percentage.
Yeah, so 40% on the effective cases though, that's really good, right? And it sounds like the computational work, right? The boilerplate stuff, it's really good at, and you can save a whole bunch of time. But then when it comes to the taste, right, the human element, the experience is kind of where you're putting your time into.
Right. I think specifically for this app, one of the one of the more time-consuming parts would have been analyzing the existing repo because like Scott mentioned, it was Kotlin Multiplatform. It's a pretty large repo. It uses native code. So that alone saved quite a bit of time. The productivity increase would probably be different if we were working on a greenfield project and building an app from scratch. And then I don't know if the productivity increase would be as significant there, but I would be interested to interested to try.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
We had the luxury in this app of having like a reference implementation of most of the features in another platform framework language. And it was awesome having Claude Code's ability to analyze an existing code base and explain the business logic for it, both to re-implement it itself and for us to implement or us to understand what was going on. Like there's some calculations for like for weight and calories recommendations for pregnant women that are a little bit more, there's a little bit more business logic in there or like a little bit more subtle logic. And it's in another language and another style of programming. So it was cool to just have that break it down.
Yeah, then that's another case of like where our intersection, like, or responsibilities kind of increases engineers, right, to solve those problems, design those problems up front, which is a cost, of course. But having Claude be there to translate existing rules and calculations, I could see it could be a really big benefit. Daniel, was there any feature specifically where you found like a large productivity gain, something that it was really effective at?
Yeah, there's a calendar in the app, which on the calendar section of the app, you can view events from the last week. Well, you can scroll through all time and view all events. But you can also like add appointments, which appointments would be useful for like if you wanted to say, I had a doctor's appointment this afternoon or something like that. Time, as most developers know, like dates and time, like it's just like it's a very, very frustrating thing to work with. And I ended up implementing this calendar that already existed in both iOS and Android and Kotlin Multiplatform. Basically used Claude to do it, and it ended up getting me there a lot quicker than it would have if I had done it just like home rolled it on my own. It used a pre-existing package. It was like React Native calendars or something like that from Wix, I think. But it was able to get all of the time handling and date handling set to work the same in React Native as it was set up in Kotlin Multiplatform. And that ends up being really nice for me, like as a developer, because then like I can go focus on the styling and stuff like that and not have to worry about all of the like the time details. Yeah, that ends up like I've had to work on a counter before using this exact same library, and like it was a nightmare trying to get all the pieces of state like in sync. Just like, like the counter used it differently than the backend did. So yeah, this using Claude for that helped eliminate a lot of stress right off the bat, which was really nice.
To bring it back up a level from IC, like the other part of the equation is I'm assuming overall code was moving faster. You're just able to generate more components, more code through the pipeline. So that has some other challenges as well, such as, how were you guys as a team able to handle reviews, right? And then, Scott, from your position, what was the overall quality of the code? Was it the same? Was it worse? Was it better? Yeah, can you describe kind of how it is, the output, right? What the output was like?
It was terrible. No. No, it was really good. And it was impressive because I feel like it felt like to me features were getting developed faster than they would have otherwise. Velocity does seem higher. And I feel like we get like draft level of a pretty meaty feature in like a day and then completed in 2 or 3 days, maybe. But draft level, we're like, here's that thing working and stepping through it. And then it's getting into the polishing phase, which is nice because then you're just like, once you get something that you can edit and editorialize, then you can get there. But getting to that initial level of draft level completion, I feel like AI was really helpful in getting that done quickly. I also, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like it happily generates oodles of code, and it's not the most dry or like the principle of do not repeat yourself in programming, where we try to like make reusable components and use them everywhere. It becomes a little harder to do that with AI tools because they're generative. All they want to do is generate more code. So you have to guide them if you want them to reuse existing code. And Claude Code is pretty good about that because it's like analyzed your code base and it builds up this context of the patterns, and you can create rules files for like in every prompt, you're sending it the rules of like, do things this certain way that we as humans, we build up this context in our brains as we get onboarded onto a project and we learn the patterns. But AI kind of like, it resets its brain every time you start anew. And the only thing it has to go on is like, well, all its pre-existing training data of all the React on the internet, plus its analysis of your code base and your rules files. So it's really important to explain in as much detail of like how you want something done, as in addition to what you want done. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. It actually reminded me of an observation that I've had with some on the other projects where I've been working with Claude, where a lot of times, you're driving towards a feature and the very first thing you want to do is get that MVP, right? You want to get the feature working, right? And a lot of times, sometimes that's all you're able to deliver with your timeline. If you've got 2 days, a week, whatever it is, the only thing you can do is that maybe naive brute force approach. And that's what gets checked in. And a lot of times you don't have the budget to go back and rewrite it. So that is in production. It works, but there's opportunity for improvement. Whereas now using Claude, a lot of times in that same amount of time, right? My MVP, even if I still take the full amount of time, now that MVP implementation includes more of the bells and whistles, right? A more hardened function with more tests or a more robust set of functionality, right? It's got overall, you know, there's definitely danger for spaghetti code and useless code. You don't want to just put everything in there. But overall, I'm getting more complete code, right? That in the same, even if it's the same amount of time or a lot of times less time. Did you guys notice any of that? Like, the code was just maybe a little bit more mature the first time through the PR, or was that just, am I asking God to do too much myself?
It depended for me. I think sometimes it tended to add more validation than you might. So, like using the example of a form, it tended to add more validation than you might have time for an MVP, which was really helpful. At the same time, I think it can also easily miss security issues and needed a fair amount of oversight as far as even building reusable code. Sometimes it would forget that we already had reusable components that we had built, for example, like to build the form. And so I would have to remind it, and then I would need to redo the form, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so it was a bit unreliable as far as outputting production ready code on the first go, and generally needed some hand holding along the way, even with context provided to it. But yeah, I think generally it does help you arrive at production ready code faster with enough oversight.
Yeah, I would agree. Like it can do some things. Like I find like that there's a lot of duplicated code, but also another thing that I find frustrating with it sometimes is like it has the idea of just slapping on another use effect, and like that ends up causing just like all sorts of state issues and stuff like that. It becomes very difficult, impossible for Claude to debug, but very difficult for me as a developer to debug. But it's typically pretty good, as Scott mentioned, at getting it to like a near production ready, or at least a draft state where like you're kind of ironing out the edge cases. And that's where like I feel like the big benefit is like you're still going to need to be the developer and still need to get over to the finish line, but it's at least going to get you to, close to the end, which is really nice and a lot quicker.
I want to mention internationalization. I thought that was a big win for it. So this app was already internationalized to have Spanish and English translations. So everywhere in the app, all of the strings you see in the user interface, there's variables for them. So like if you see, a button where it says, log exercise, that's a string that is a variable for English. And there's a Spanish version of that as well. And so we're starting to create some new features now, and it will happily make Spanish versions of everything super easily. Now, I don't know if we've vibe coded the Spanish too much and they're not correct, but at least we have, probably the draft level internationalization getting done very quickly. So that was a good win.
Great. Well, it's a good place to start wrapping it up. I'm curious to hear from each of you, kind of from a dev-esque experience. Like, how do you like working in this mode, right? Where do you personally see it going, and does that excite you, or how would you like to see it used in a different way to make it more effective? Like, is there opportunities there that you've discovered?
Yeah, I don't know. I've enjoyed it as a developer, mostly just because I mentioned it earlier, but I've been using Cursor for the last few months, and it feels like a significant step up from Cursor. And so like just right off the bat as a baseline, that's been very nice. Not just getting frustrated by the limited scope that Cursor tends to have. But yeah, like I don't know, like I really do enjoy it. Last week I still programmed a couple screens on my own. Like they were just like pretty much all UI, but because I enjoy that aspect, but also like it does take out. I've mentioned this to you obviously a ton of times, Dustin. Like I really like doing UI, backend, and all that kind of stuff. No backend work here, but the visual aspect is really fun to me. And so Claude being able to come in and handle some of the more business logic kind of stuff ends up making my job as a developer a lot more interesting because I can get it to where it's working really well on that front, and then it'll get pretty good on the UI, and then I can polish it. And so that's like a really, really fun developer flow for me. And I think long term, like obviously we've seen like these tools have just completely blown up and gotten a lot better since ChatGPT 3.0 or 3.5, whatever the first one was that people started using. It's only going to get more complex and complicated, but also a lot better at doing what it does. So I don't know, like long term, I don't know. It's tough to say. Like it's gonna have, like Scott mentioned, like posting screenshots, getting it to make screens based off the screenshots. Like I think it's only gonna get better at doing that. And so as a developer, I don't know, it's just gonna become more and more high level. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm kind of losing myself on the answer, but I think as a developer, even like as a mid-level developer, you'll start getting into more like architecting features and having Claude do it all for you. And it's just going to get better at that. It's going to have a better context, and it'll just be more successful consistently.
I can hop into. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts here. It's been a really interesting, I guess, couple of months working with Claude. I think, Daniel, maybe this is somewhat what you're saying, but I really enjoy the coding aspect, and so it's been different to have that abstracted to Claude, and sometimes I miss that. But at the same time, it's really satisfying whenever you're able to work with it effectively to be more productive and then stepping in, whenever Claude has kind of reached its boundary of what it can do with whatever feature that you're working on. So that's been an interesting kind of like mental effect of it, I think, of kind of abstracting like the physical coding aspect of it and kind of the fun part of figuring out problems as you go. As far as whether as far as where it will go, I think that's a question that everyone is asking and that a lot of people have answers, and I don't know if any of them are are, are well founded. I think that we're all kind of figuring that out as we go. I think that the tooling will definitely get better, and I think the technology itself will absolutely get better, and I think it will become overall an indispensable tool that we'll use for development. The extent of that, I still am curious of. But yeah, overall, it's been a net positive getting to work with it so much with this project and getting to explore with it and figuring out what works and what doesn't work with a Claude. So yeah, it's been an interesting experience.
Scott, I'm really hoping that the next time we do one of these talks, we've got one of our projects hooked up to that review, right? And that review PR update loop, right? That is maybe not 100% agentic, right? But where a lot of that tooling is automated, right? And it's just going to act as another check, right? Because at the end of the day, we're the ones that are approving the PRs and doing the final review on the code. But to cut out some of that, well, to allow us to be able to keep up with the PRs, right? And the velocity as the processes that Laurie and Daniel have talked about, as the tooling on the contribution side improves, right? There's got to be tooling and improvement on the next level workflow, right? The review and the deployment processes too have got to be able to keep up in a safe way, right? In a transparent, observable way. So I hope that we can start working on that pretty soon, maybe in the next project or so, to start working on those flows and those integrations.
Yeah, it really helps when it's in an agent flow. It lets it know if it's done or if it needs to keep going. Like, oh, because like with the website where I've got this kind of flow going, it will show you, or it will check like the screenshots of the website and decide for itself, am I done? Or nope, there's still an error there. And there's been times where it's like, nope, it's still an error there. And it was able to get to correct the error and fix it. Doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. And then it can get to the point where it's going to notify you, hey Dustin, this PR is ready for you to review now, which is cool. I would say overall for AI and software development, for me, this is pushing my written communication skills. Like I was already having to do this already for like working with other developers to like write specs for features and to explain succinctly or articulate a problem. And that's just more important than ever. We're working with these kind of tools where like the input is English. In the future, it'll be other input, I guess, but you still will need to like explain what you want or have some kind of like some loop flow where it asks you questions to like get what you want out of you so that it can build it.
Yeah, it's easy to think or forget that it's trained on language, right? You think of it as this, machine that spits out code, but at the end of the day, it's the input is language, right? So those communication skills, it's the more clear, concise, and effective you are in communicating with it through that medium, the better results you're going to get. In that case, it makes sense that we got to treat it like another developer, right? Another team member, and we we can't really expect it to behave, as a super developer. It's got limitations, just like a human would.
And it's got limitations that a human doesn't have, that like this limited context window that will eventually it gets tired, but in a different way. Like the longer and longer and more context you put into it, like the less reliable it gets, which is interesting. Like, and you kind of have to reset. It's kind of like letting it sleep and clear its context out.
Yeah. That describes the shift that we saw from like the vibe coding, like prompt engineering to context engineering, which is a whole different topic to talk about maybe next time. But yeah, super fun stuff. Yeah. Final comments from anybody before we take off?
Yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah. Thanks for your insights, Daniel, Laurie. I've had a good time kind of going back and forth with you both over the course of this project. I'm really excited to see the finished project. It's looking great. I think everybody's really happy with it.
Yeah, thanks for moderating, Dustin.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Cool. Thanks. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.